Hi, this is Justin Gordon. I've got a website called railsonmaui.com and a forum called also forum.railsonmaui.com. I'm explaining to a friend of mine, Aaron, who's learning how to do Ruby on Rails programming, how Rspec works and how the Ruby programming language works, and a little bit about the expect change matcher. This is some really subtle syntax here with Ruby blocks. So it's really important that you get this. I think it took me a little while when I learned Ruby on Rails to understand the nuances of this. And a lot of this has to do with not so much Rails programming, but understanding how the Ruby programming language works. For example, so let's go take a look at the Rspec docs on the expect matcher. Like what are we actually trying to verify here? So like we're going to say expect something's going to happen and it's going to change something. Like an example for that is you might expect some Ruby code to say add a new record to a model, etc. And then you're going to verify that actually happened. So what's interesting here is that expect in the Rspec language, this is a method call here, and it's going to take a block. And on the result of that, it's going to call this. It's going to take that and it's going to call this part 2. And then 2 is going to take change. And change is going to take either a couple parameters here or it's going to take a block. And this is actually explained a bit more thoroughly in the actual documentation for the change class. For the expectations for the matchers. So here we go over to change, and here we're going to go click on there, and now we're in the matchers. So over here, we've got some good examples. Expect. This block is going to happen and it's going to change the roster by this count. So it's going to actually just change the count. Sometimes you want to see that what we're going to do is we're going to change the roster.count by 1, and then we might want to change it by at least 1 and by at most 1. So it should be hammering in what exactly are we verifying here. So this is actually, I think, possibly a newer Rspec syntax. I actually have not used this one too much. I've mostly used this one. So say this string right there, and this is, we're going to call expect string.reverse, and it's going to change the contents of string from string to the actual reversing of that. Let's take a closer look at this syntax here. So, yeah?
If it is not what it is it's expected to be,
yeah.
Does that raise an exception or?
Well, if it's not what it's expected to be, your test will fail.
Got it.
So that's how that works. So here we're calling expect, and expect is going to take a block, and there's the block it's going to call it with, and it's going to expect to change, and it's going to call, it's going to evaluate this string. So in this case, for say the string here, we wanted to make sure we actually evaluated it again. So we're calling it with this block, and I find it's incredibly important to put spaces around the braces here, because if you don't, it looks like you're calling change with parens, and if you do that, you're going to have a mistake. So it's going to change it from string to that. Let's take a look at a couple more of these. You can call this with a not to change. And down here, we're calling this change again, but this time we're taking an object, employee, and we're going to we're going to pass the title in there, and that's going to call a method on employee. So what's happening here whenever we're expecting a change is we have to evaluate something before we call this block, and we have to evaluate something after we call this block. And that's why you don't just call change with just some normal plain old value. Like for example, you couldn't just call it with the string here, because we actually have to evaluate the string before and we have to evaluate the string afterwards. So going up to the, let's go take a look back at one really important line here. So when passing a block, so notice here, we just covered over and over again how you can pass the receiver and a message or a block, but not both. So by receiver and message, it means like this. Here's the receiver, and the message is something like count. Or we're passing it a block like string, or we could have called, let's see, it's the only one of those, but you could have called this person.birthday, for example. And you would pass that, if you called person.birthday, you got to pass that with the curly braces. So there's a really key point here. It says that we must use that the braces there and not the do end syntax, as the braces will bind to the change method, whereas the do end right here would errantly bind to the expect or the expect not to method. So what does that exactly mean? If we take a look down below here at this example here, simple example right there, if we call the expect to change, we replace that with a do end there, what's happening is that the do end is going to get bound to that result. It's going to go, as opposed to, because of the operator precedence of the braces, it gets bound to the change method. So it's incredibly important that you don't mix up that with the do end. I do find that on this block right here, when you call expect, and if you pass a do end right there, well, it's clear the only place that do end can bind to is this expect call right there. So that right there could be a do end. However, right here, that cannot be a do end. This block has to be bound to the change and not to this one. Because of the lower precedence of do end, what would happen is you'd end up calling to, and then you'd call change. You call this to method, and notice we're passing it the parameter. And the parameter we're passing it is the result of this evaluation right there. So what would happen is, instead of passing it the parameter of that evaluation, you'd be passing it change, and change is like you're passing it a method, and then it just wouldn't make sense because then you're also calling to with the additional block. So it's got to be like this. You have to call it like that. And the other thing to just reiterate is just make sure you put the spaces around the braces, because otherwise it ends up looking too much like this. If we go back to the original explanation here for how to expect something to change, over here you can see it clearer is that we're using this with parens right there, or we're calling change object.attribute. Notice these are the same exact thing. You're calling object.attribute, and that means call the object with the method attribute. And there's some more examples down below. In the examples down below, it's interesting. They don't have the extra spaces there. And you notice how it's almost like, if you aren't looking for this, it's almost a little hard to read. Like, you might think you're calling change, and that's calling this as a parameters, counter.count. But remember, this is a block there. You're always calling change with a block, or you're calling it with the receiver and the message.